मतलब दिसता स्ता सा मतलब दे जब मरगुनु बदा तमकम स्ता नाम चाने शाखस्ते दा माई और दा साई नाम खस्तल दोई वजबुल कत्ल गुनाश मरवलो पडाड या दरता खलम पयार या दरता खलम
जनाब साहिबजादा कासिम सियाल साहब
पाकिस्तान के अवाम ने फैसला करना है इन्होंने खिदमत की.
Good evening and welcome to the world today. We're going to be discussing the birth of a new movement in Pakistan, which is different from all the existing political parties in the country, and which has developed very quickly in response to the continuing assaults on the Pashtun communities in Pakistan after 9/11. With me today are Zakir Hussain, one of the leaders in Britain of the new Pashtun movement, the Pashtun self-defense movement, or the Pashtun protection movement as they still call it in Pakistan, and Mahvesh Ahmed, who studies at Cambridge, is doing a PhD there and has been centrally involved in building solidarity amongst non-Pashtuns and the global left to understand what is going on. The history of Pakistan is, of course, a tormented one. This is a country whose military refused to accept the verdict of the people in 1970 and preferred to divide the country by waging a brutal civil war in East Pakistan, which subsequently became Bangladesh. The condition and position of the minority provinces in what was left of Pakistan has never been a healthy one. They've constantly been under fire, bribed, cajoled, imprisoned, tortured, and this is a process which has been going on for some time. 9/11 and what followed made it worse. And the reason it made it worse is because the American occupation of Afghanistan saw a huge assault on the Pashtun communities in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The communities, the Pashtun tribes, divided from each other by British rule and the imposition of the Durand Line, which divided Pakistan from Afghanistan. Prior to that, movement between the two parts of the country was very open. But effectively, the area has been under martial law, under military rule, despite the political facade, because it's a strategically extremely important area in the country now, and the people who have been suffering the most in Pakistan are the Pashtuns. This is the historical background to what is happening now, that after long years, a national movement has emerged, the Pashtun self-defense movement, whose aim is very straightforward: to defend the human and civil rights and social rights of the Pashtun people. And the interesting thing is that with the Pashtun spread all over the country, huge Pashtun population in Karachi, in Lahore, in other cities, internal migration in the search for jobs when the country was being industrialized, there have now been large gatherings of Pashtun people in Karachi, in Lahore, and of course in Pakhtunkhwa, which is the Pashtun province in the country, or part of it. The rest is in Afghanistan. Both of you welcome. Zakir, I'll come to you first. Explain to me the origins of the movement, what triggered it off, and how it grew so quickly with popular support.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much. Pashtuns have been on the geographical location which has always been very hot area, historically speaking, geographically speaking, and strategically speaking. After the death of Naqibullah Masood.
Who was Naqibullah Masood?
Naqibullah Masood was a very common social media
He was a model.
Yeah. It was due to corruption of the police, corruption of the organizations. And he was taken and then martyred, and then he was killed. But after his death, it was disclosed that it was not only Naqibullah Masood. There were more than 400 Pashtuns, boys, young boys, who had been killed. So when that came out in Karachi, when that came out, there was a concern about, and people were thinking about it, that where are or other missing persons who have been taken from that tribal area, from Swat area, from other areas. And it's astonishing that almost 34,000 persons are missing.
So the total figure of those disappeared, probably killed, is 34,000.
34,000.
Okay.
So those all things, those all concerns, those surfaced. And it was a spontaneous movement which was launched by the ordinary Pashtun youth by themselves, taking no sort of guidance from any political party. It was a spontaneous movement. And you know, the movement is the best teacher, it's the best guide. During the course of the movement, they got trained on political issues.
They learned through their own experiences.
Yeah.
So who would you describe as the leaders of this organization, and what is their age group?
The leadership itself is definitely Manzoor Pashtun, who's 27 years old.
Yeah.
He comes from he is from the Masouds, and he is part of a generation of young Pashtuns from what is called the tribal areas, an area still governed under colonial era laws of collective punishment, areas that around the world are known for drone bombardments, for being suspected of being hubs of militancy. He is of the generation that have escaped because of war, these areas, and been forced to live in refugee camps. And there is literally, has been a huge outmigration of young Pashtuns, of so-called, from these tribal areas to other cities around Pakistan because of this war. And every time they come to these other cities, what happens is that because of existing racialized tropes about the Pashtuns as backwards and tribal and terrorists, you have other ethnicities, especially Punjabi, which is the majority ethnicity of which you and I are a part, that they say we don't want Pashtuns here. There's a huge amounts of ghettoization because of that. Similarly, in 2014, when the Pakistan Army launched a massive operation called Operation Zarb-e-Azam in Waziristan, what we saw, and this was an operation that was launched, with the full support of Barack Obama and David Cameron, with the full support of all of the foreign correspondents, all of the diplomats, because the idea was, we're going to get all of these militant groups. People were not warned. They were bombed in the middle of the night. 1 million people had to flee by foot in the middle of the summer for 3 days. I reported in the refugee camps that they arrived to, there were people whose children had died on the way. There were people who had lost brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers. And a lot of these Pashtuns who had run away, and this is the kind of generation that both the leadership and a lot of the people taking part in the protests are from, when a lot of these people arrived and afterwards tried to leave these refugee camps, they were met with blockades in all of the cities with chief ministers and politicians saying, we don't want them to settle here, even though these people are technically absolutely Pakistani citizens and have every right
can live wherever
to live
they
anywhere.
want.
We even saw the very famous filmmaker Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy tweet out that she doesn't want them to come to Karachi. And she was harangued and criticized for that. The kind of racialized tropes about Pashtuns is widespread in Pakistan and justifies a lot of violence by the military, but also by a lack of empathy and a lack of knowledge about what's been going on in the rest of the country.
The situation is very different. but upper middle class reaction to the Bengalis was not so different in West Pakistan.
Yeah.
Especially in Karachi, in some of the Punjabi cities, people felt we're superior to the Bengalis. Our skin is lighter. The Bengalis, after all, are only recent converts to Islam, unlike us. Total nonsense, by the way. And they can't quite say that about the Pashtuns, because, the Pashtuns, if one's going by skin color, are fairer. But what they can say is that these are tribal nobodies, upstarts, and a class attitude begins to play. Do we want these people in our city? I'm very shocked what you've said about Chinoy, that she tweeted out like this.
The same thing, the other group that's being disappeared, the Baloch, also face similar kinds of accusations of being backward and tribal and hierarchical. But what's interesting about both of these communities that have been violated, disappeared, killed, tortured, is that when it comes to progressive movements and organizing, they have a huge and long history of progressive organizing. So young Pashtuns, especially the ones turning out now, are organizing in the streets against the military. That is an incredibly radical thing to do in Pakistan. To speak that openly against the military is incredibly radical. In the same way, in the Baloch areas, you have had actually a huge mobilization among Baloch women who have come out, and because boys and men get picked up, Baloch women are now the faces of the missing persons movement. And that defies all of the stereotypes about these communities as backwards and tribal, etc. And in fact, what instead you see is a deeply radical progressive challenge to a patriarchal, capitalist, imperial-supported state and military state.
What are the demands of the movement now? The Pashtun self-defense movement, in terms of the state, let's say the state sends someone to negotiate, saying, what do you people want from us? What would the demands be? Zakir, why don't you say
very simple demands, very, very simple. First demand was and is regarding the killing of Naqibullah Masood. The culprit has been arrested, but treated as if he is a state guest.
Who killed him too?
It was a police officer in Karachi.
Rao Anwar?
Rao Anwar.
But Rao Anwar is a well-known semi-fascist thug who's responsible for killing lots of people.
And he is a tool for the military.
Yeah.
We know, everybody knows. Who is protecting him? It is the military who is protecting him. The first demand is regarding him.
So that's the first demand, that the police officer, Rao Anwar, who killed him, is tried properly. And
tried and investigated properly.
Okay, that's the first demand.
This is the first demand. Okay. Second demand is regarding the checkpoints, the checkposts
in Pakhtunkhwa.
In Pakhtunkhwa and tribal areas, both. That is really an example of disgracing a person, humiliating a person, a nation, woman, children. Equally, everybody is disgraced and humiliated there on those checkposts.
Not to take away the dignity of the people from them, which happens at all checkpoints. Palestine, Israel is a key example. So what you're suggesting is that what is going on in the Pakhtun areas is very similar to that.
Yes.
And the third demand is, it is regarding the missing persons. And the demand is very genuine. It is that, okay, bring them before the court according to law. Because the Pakistani constitution says that nobody can be arrested and kept under custody more than 24 hours unless he is produced before a magistrate. After 24, you are bound to produce him before a magistrate. But scores of years have passed, and there are people who are missing.
Mavesh, if we are to try and build a solidarity movement with the Pashtuns on a global scale, introduce them to progressive movements elsewhere, what would your main arguments be?
Well, the first thing that I've found very interesting in terms of organizing solidarity work with the Pashtun self-defense movement is that there's, despite a lot of organizing all over the world against the war on terror, against imperial intervention, there's surprisingly little that people know about Pashtuns, despite the fact that Pashtuns were one of the first victims of 9/11. We have a lot of people talking about drones on the global left, and a lot of people talking about US funding for militaries like the Pakistani military. We had a lot of people talking about the Afghan war, and yet nobody knows who the Pashtuns were. And so the first work of solidarity is, of course, to learn about one another and to learn about the sort of lives and homes and experiences of the Pashtuns of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of course, in this moment, particularly Pakistan. The second thing is, of course, to learn, I mean, it actually makes sense to just be aware of the fact that of the numbers in terms of how many people have died in Pakistan are, of course, unclear a lot of times. But one number, roughly we can say that of the around 60 to 80,000, and it's unclear.
As a result of both Pakistan military assaults and the United States attacks?
And yes, and militancy. At least 75% have died just in the Pashtun areas. So what you have is Pashtun populations caught between three forms of violence. You have Pakistani military violence, imperial violence, and the violence of militancy groups. And the ones who primarily get killed are Pashtun peoples. The other thing is that, of course, the Pashtun movement itself has been linked into global left networks for huge parts of its history.
But the thing is this, that we have to be very concrete now. For most people, the idea of a Pashtun movement is the Taliban.
Yes.
Who are Pashtuns, there's no doubt about it, many of whom were trained in Pakistan, sent into Afghanistan, won a lot of popular support, whether we like it or not. So one can't cover all this up. One has to see how this happened, why it happened. And the fact that the United States hasn't been able to defeat them till now, despite this long occupation, is precisely because the Taliban, in their own religious way, represent a form of Pashtun defense.
There's a very interesting quote in Manzoor Pashtun, who is the face of the movement, in his speech in Lahore, where he says, soldiers and the Taliban are victims of the generals, and we, all of us, are victims of the soldiers and the Taliban. And what you kind of hear from that is that I think we need to have a much more complex conversation about the Taliban. The Taliban are definitely, there's a militancy going on. And of course, Taliban specifically means student. And so there's people who do, so there is, at the heart of both of this conflict between, on the one hand, militaries and on the other hand, militancy, is an elite of generals who play them up against each other, and in the middle of it, ordinary people get caught.
No, the point I'm trying to make is that we live in an epoch where the left has suffered huge defeats. And in this vacuum, when there is no progressive force available or ready or willing to take the lead, many other people do it. People who are not progressive at all, like the Taliban and like others. And this is a separate question, of course, but the absence of the left is linked to the whole collapse of the Soviet Union, etc., etc. But in the situation which exists today, I would argue that the emergence of the Pashtun self-defense movement is a very interesting sign of the first time spontaneously many Pashtuns who are neither in favor of religious militancy, who are not in favor of collaborating with the United States and the Pakistan army, have come together and are agitating, marching in the streets of Pakistan, not Afghanistan. And that, I think, is quite significant, because if this carries on, it will spread into Afghanistan as well, without any doubt, sooner or later. So is there any form of organization, because even self-organization is organized?
Yes, organization is very necessary. And this is too much a heterogeneous type of movement. That there are people from different political ideologies in this movement.
Of course.
And those ideologies can't be, I think it will be not a good treatment to it to bring it into
one party.
One party or
That's
one
impossible.
thing. Yeah, it's
national
impossible.
movements are always like that, by the way.
These are genuine problems.
Yeah.
The genuine problems is that we know, as you told that there were Taliban were Pastunes, but this was a force made and created by on the first place by the international imperialism, and on the second place by the Pakistani military.
Yes, no doubt about that.
Yeah. The operations were oriented against the people. No operation was never oriented against Taliban or any insurgency. It was against the people.
By
Just
the
to suppress
Pakistan
it.
army.
Yeah, and in Pakhtunkhwa and Pakhtun areas, there was, I can't relate those stories. This Ali Wazir, by himself, his 17 people of his family were killed. 11 of them on one day. And Ali Wazir was arrested by at that time he was under custody. So they brought him under handcuffs to his father, uncle, cousins, brothers, nephews, all of them. They were murdered the same day, they were killed the same day. So against that, the people would come. It was very natural that, yes, there was left element. In absence of left element in that movement, that would have not been organized in such a fashion. Yes, everywhere, left was there.
But the left is very small.
Very small. Anyways, its guidance was it was really valuable guidance.
Yeah. The leadership of the PTM movement has a collective, as Zakir Lala explained, a collective of people from different political parties. And many of those political parties are Pashtun left-wing people who have a long history, come from families with long histories of left organizing. And they've played a key role in doing corner meetings around the different cities and rallying people to make sure that they show up. So even though it's small, it's also incredibly significant in ensuring that you have a very, very clear message coming from the PTM movement as well, which has been, you mentioned constitutional rights. It's been release or disappeared, stop putting checkpoints and harassing us on checkpoints, stop killing us in encounter killings, bring those who are disappeared to courts if there's any accusations against them, otherwise release them. These are kind of very clear and very basic demands that the movement are making, and the kind of guidance that, or the decisions being made are being made by a lot of key left Pashtuns.
Okay, let's have last questions now. Do you think the movement in Pakistan is going to be able to achieve its goals on its own, or will it need to win over other parts of Pakistan, the Punjabis, the Sindhis, to their cause before any change is possible?
I think no movement can do it, particularly in situation in Pakhtunkhwa. No movement can do it with a solo flight. It will need other people. It will need people from other nationalities. Particularly, the only people who would help are the progressive people of the country. This is straightforward the thing. No rightist is going to do anything regarding the lives of the people and other things. It is the left which will be doing all those things. Though it is very small enough, but it can cultivate a thought there. And that thought is very powerful. It can only be done through those people. And international solidarity, as Mahesh said.
Mahesh, what do you think we can do in the United States and Europe on this question? It's unknown. You know, people don't know it, they don't want to know it. I find by and large that these days so much has changed. You know, we talk about the Pashtuns in Pakistan. I mean, under 2 million people have died in Iraq. People are dying in Syria every day. 30,000 people were killed in Libya. Yeah. Because of the way in which these countries are run, you know, the citizens get exhausted, tired, the news isn't reported properly, so it's very difficult. So what would you suggest on this?
I mean, of course, there's the issue of sort of overexposure to all of these stories.
Not to mention Palestine.
Yeah, Israel. Palestine, Syria. Now, the first thing to remember is that when it comes to Pashtuns, particularly, there are huge Pashtun communities all over the West. They make up a significant portion of refugees coming into both Europe and the US. And what we're seeing actually is that Manzoor Pashtun, the leader of the PTM movement, is doing speeches on the phones to migrants and workers here in Birmingham, in London, in New York, in Copenhagen, and all sorts of places. Because these migrant communities are from working class communities, they come as a working class. Unlike, for example, Syrian refugee communities, Palestinian refugee communities who maybe have some sort of highly educated, very sophisticated people coming in, these are actual working class communities. And so the first thing is to connect with existing communities that are already organizing around the PTM movement and doing solidarity rallies already around the Western world. The other thing is then figuring out, what kind of support can one, as a non-Pashtun and as non-Pakistani, give movements like that. And that can be helping with media exposure, helping with putting in requests or putting pressure on Western governments. Because on the one hand, you have these governments talk about human rights, and then on the other hand, you have them giving, funding them in other ways. So one of the solidarity work that is possible is beginning to question governments in the UK and the US, especially, about the kind of support they give for the military, about what sort of demands they have made on the Pakistani military around disappearances and extraordinary rendition, and filing various kinds of requests to figure out what exactly has been going on. The different WikiLeaks and lots of other leaks around what's been going on has showed us that Western governments have constantly and always collaborated with the Pakistani military on getting lists of names of who crosses the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's been a normal thing, getting full lists of who might be potential suspects, and of getting people delivered who they need to black sites. So these are, the PTM movement has its hands full in Pakistan in marching there. But the Pakistani military doesn't just exist, in a vacuum. It exists with a huge amount of support, and it's completely been inflated. In fact, if you look at funding to the Pakistani state from 47 on, it was not until 2008 that American funding, American funding has only come to Pakistan under military regimes in that entire period. Every time we switch to a democratic regime, it goes to zero. And most of the funding goes to the military, and it goes to surveillance equipment and weapons equipment that gets used on the bodies of ordinary Pakistanis.
Zakir and Mahesh, thank you very much for coming. It's a conversation we will continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
او کنا ته خامخا ته بدماش جوړیږي خامخا غونډګردي کوي خامخا ما وجني دښمنی را سره کوي ولې نه پوهېږي موږ د تېره یوه میاشتې راسې دا پښتانه را پاسېدلي هم دي خبرې هم کوي او ریاست له تر اوسه پرې ځان کوڼ کړی دی دغه خبرې که څوک اوري د ریاست اعلی ادارې هغه د ځان پوه کړي لږ د سترګې کولاو کړي خوږونه دې کولاو کړي پښتون را پاسېدلی دی دا د خلکو را پاسېدل نه دي دا د ظالم ګروان ته د لاس ورنږدې کېږي د پښتانه